The night my brother stood up at his own anniversary gala and told 200 people I was the kind of family embarrassment best kept in the service entrance. I was standing behind a linen-topped station near the back wall of the ballroom. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I crossed my arms and watched him perform for the crowd, the way I had watched him perform my entire life. Always the loudest voice in the room, always the one who needed everyone's attention, always certain that the attention was his by right. Then one of his investors leaned over to the event director standing beside him and asked, in the kind of voice that carries when a room goes quiet, "Pardon me, isn't that woman the owner of this venue?" The event director didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "She founded it." My brother had booked a gala at the venue I built without knowing it belonged to me. I'd like to say I had planned every detail of that evening carefully. I hadn't. I simply showed up to work, the way I had every single week for the better part of a decade, and let the truth find its own moment. The rest took care of itself. Growing up in Mississauga, just outside Toronto, our household ran on a very specific currency: appearances. My father had built a small event planning and catering company over 20 years, and everything he owned, the house in a good neighborhood, the car he kept freshly waxed, the suits he wore to every client meeting, was about signaling that he had arrived somewhere respectable. He wasn't wrong that appearances mattered in business. But somewhere along the way, he stopped being able to tell the difference between building something real and simply looking like he had. My brother was 4 years older than me, and from the time he could hold a clipboard at one of my father's events, he was positioned as the heir. My father introduced him to clients, let him sit in on planning meetings, took him along to industry networking nights at the convention center. When my brother graduated from the Schulich School of Business at York University, my father threw a dinner for 40 people and gave a toast that lasted 15 minutes. I sat at the end of the table and clapped. I graduated 2 years later with a hospitality management degree. My father shook my hand. It wasn't that he disliked me. In his way, I think he loved me. But he had decided early on what kind of person my brother would be, and what kind of person I would be. And no amount of evidence ever changed that picture in his mind. My brother joined the family business for a few years and eventually left to start his own consulting firm, taking several of my father's top clients with him when he went. My father was hurt by that, but he still spoke about my brother at family dinners the way some people speak about celebrities, with a kind of odd pride that had nothing to do with the actual person at the table. Meanwhile, I was still trying to earn permission to make any meaningful decisions inside the company my father had built. My stepmother, who had married my father when I was 12, had a talent for appearing neutral while consistently favoring my brother. Whenever there was a disagreement, she would tilt her head and say something like, "You have to admit he does have more experience." What experience exactly was never specified. It didn't need to be. The moment that changed everything came on a Thursday in late October. I was 27. I had been working in the family business for 5 years, and I had spent 3 months developing a proposal to expand into corporate event management, a sector genuinely growing across the GTA, with demand that our company was positioned to serve. I had done the research, built the financial projections, identified 2 potential venue partners in the city. I presented it to my father in his office. He listened, nodded, and said he would think about it. The following week, he announced at a staff meeting that my brother had suggested they explore corporate events, and that they were going to pursue it. My brother hadn't been inside the building in 2 months. I drove home that evening on the 401 in rush hour traffic, and somewhere between the Dixie Road exit and the 427 interchange, I made a decision. I wasn't going to keep asking for recognition inside a company that had already decided what I was worth. I was going to find out what I was worth somewhere else. I gave notice the following month. I was 28 when I walked into a boutique hotel in Toronto's Distillery District for a job interview as an event coordinator. The distillery was one of those parts of the city that had transformed from something industrial and forgotten into something deliberate and beautiful. Brick buildings repurposed into galleries, restaurants, and event spaces, all along cobblestone streets that felt removed from the rest of downtown. The hotel sat at the eastern edge of the district, and its ballroom was one of the most sought-after event spaces in the city. The hiring manager asked me why I wanted to start in a coordinator role when my CV showed years of management experience. I told her the truth. I wanted to understand a business from the inside before I ever claimed to run one. She hired me on a Tuesday. I started the following Monday. For the first year, I did every task I was asked to do and several I wasn't. I learned the load-in schedules for equipment vendors, the overtime thresholds that could push an event budget into deficit, the specific order in which to brief a service team so that nothing was forgotten between the kitchen and the head table. I stayed after events to help clear the ballroom. I came in early the morning after to check the reset before the next client arrived for a walkthrough. People noticed eventually. Not in a dramatic way. Nobody handed me a promotion over champagne. It was quieter than that. The senior event manager started including me in her planning calls. The director of operations invited me to shadow her during contract negotiations. Little by little, I was trusted with more, not because I had asked for it, but because I had earned it from the people working beside me. Meanwhile, my family had no idea what I was actually building. My father assumed I was working in hotels, which in his vocabulary carried a mild note of disappointment. My brother, whenever family occasions came up, had a habit of asking what I was still doing in hospitality, with the tone of a man who found the whole thing mildly baffling. My stepmother would smile and change the subject. I stopped correcting them. I stopped explaining. I learned, during those years, that some people have already decided who you are, and your energy is better spent building the thing that will eventually speak for itself. About 2 years into my time at the hotel, I was asked to sit in on a review of outstanding vendor contracts. We were restructuring several supplier agreements, and as I worked through the files, I came across documentation from an event hosted 3 years earlier, before my time, involving a corporate client who had ultimately defaulted on a significant payment. The client's business name was unfamiliar, but as I traced the contract further, I found correspondence that referenced a referral. The referral had come from my brother's consulting firm. I kept reading. What I eventually pieced together was this. My brother had referred an under-resourced client to the hotel in exchange for a commission arrangement he had never properly disclosed to either party. The hotel had honored its contract and absorbed the loss when the client failed to pay. My brother had collected his referral fee before the event had even taken place. It was not technically illegal. The referral had been disclosed in broad terms, though not in the way it should have been. But it was the kind of thing that tells you exactly what someone is willing to do when they believe no one is watching. I thought about my proposal, the one my father had turned into my brother's idea. I thought about every meeting I had been excluded from, every decision made without me, every time someone in my family had looked right past something I had built. I didn't seek revenge. I had learned by then that revenge requires you to keep looking backward, and I had too much ahead of me for that. The hotel's situation deteriorated over the following 18 months. The ownership group, 3 partners who had operated the property since the distillery's revitalization, had been in conflict for some time, and the dispute was quietly strangling the business. 2 partners wanted to sell. The third was resistant but increasingly outvoted. Debt had accumulated on property improvements that hadn't generated the returns they'd expected, and the building was in real danger of changing hands to buyers who had no interest in running an event venue. When it became clear that a sale was likely, I watched the conversation from the inside. I knew the building better than most people who might consider purchasing it. I knew the event calendar, the vendor relationships, the staff personalities and their capabilities. I knew which operating costs were genuinely necessary and which were inefficiencies a careful owner could clear away. I also knew what the building could become, because I had spent 4 years inside it imagining exactly that. I had saved carefully during my years at the hotel, a TFSA I'd been contributing to since I was 22, a small stake in a real estate investment trust I'd started funding in my late 20s. It wasn't enough alone, but it was a foundation. I reached out, quietly, to 2 people I had come to trust, a former client who had built and sold a hospitality group in the city, and a woman I'd met through a young entrepreneurs program at the Toronto Board of Trade, who had moved into property investment. I laid out the opportunity carefully, the distillery location, the venue capacity, the existing client relationships, the clear path back to profitability with the right operator. They asked good questions. I had good answers. We incorporated a numbered holding company through a lawyer in the financial district, and over 6 months of careful negotiation, we completed the purchase. I became the primary operating partner and the public face of the business to our staff and clients. Beyond the team, almost no one outside those walls knew I was involved. I continued working beside my staff every week. The employees knew I was the owner, I had told them immediately, because they deserved that truth. But they were professional people who understood discretion. My father thought I still worked there in the same capacity I always had. My brother thought the same. To both of them, the fact that I was in that building every week was simply further evidence that I hadn't found my way out of an unremarkable career in hospitality. My brother's consulting firm turned 10 in the spring, and he decided to mark the occasion the way he marked most things, with maximum visibility. He wanted a proper dinner, 200 guests, formal service, a string quartet, a keynote from a speaker he'd been trying to impress for 2 years. He wanted the kind of evening that would make the people in that room feel certain they were dealing with someone serious. He chose my venue. I learned about the booking, the same way I learned about every booking, through our event management system, which sent me a summary of every confirmed reservation. I saw his company name in the client field and sat with it for a moment. There are people who would have picked up the phone immediately. I am not one of those people. I approved the booking, let our event team handle every client interaction, and reviewed the floor plan, the menu selections, and the AV setup notes the same way I would for any event. On the evening of the gala, I put on my work clothes, dark jacket, flat shoes, and showed up to do what I always did, work alongside my team. The ballroom looked exactly as it should. Tables set with white linen, low floral centerpieces, the chandeliers dimmed to a warm register that made the old brickwork glow. The bar near the entrance was already drawing a crowd by 7. My staff had prepared meticulously, and every detail in that room reflected their effort. I moved through the space quietly, checking in with the service team, speaking briefly with the kitchen, reviewing the timing on the evening's program. The guests arrived in waves. Bay Street professionals, a few names from the business sections of the Globe and Mail, several people whose presence told me my brother had done exactly what he'd always been good at, curating the right audience for himself. He saw me sometime during cocktail hour. I watched the recognition cross his face, the brief, surprised pause, and then that particular expression I had known my entire childhood, the look that meant he had just found something to use. The formal program began after dinner. My brother had arranged it so he would speak toward the end of the evening, a capstone address to close the celebration. He was good at public speaking, I'll give him that. He moved through the room with his wireless microphone like someone who had been practicing for exactly this kind of night, because he had been. He was midway through a passage about his company's growth trajectory, when he looked toward the back of the room, and found me standing near a service station, checking that the late evening coffee course was prepared. And speaking of people who choose interesting paths, he said, pivoting so smoothly I might have admired it if the words hadn't been aimed in my direction. Some of you may have noticed one of the staff members tonight. That's my sister. He gestured toward me. 200 faces turned my way at once. She's always preferred to stay in the background, he continued. Some people are built for the spotlight, and some people are built too. He let that trail deliberately and smiled. We love her anyway. The laugh he received was the uncertain, uncomfortable kind. The laugh people produce when they sense something is wrong, but don't know how to name it. Several people near the front of the room weren't laughing at all. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I stood where I was and looked at him the way you look at something familiar that no longer holds any power over you. I had heard versions of that performance my entire life. I had learned by then that responding to it gave it more weight than it deserved. My brother took my silence as confirmation that he had, as always, gotten away with something. He turned back to his audience and began steering toward his closing remarks. That was when the investor from Vancouver, a man who had been introduced to me an hour earlier by our event director, who had shaken my hand and asked detailed questions about the venue's capacity and our capital structure, who had told me he'd been looking at Toronto properties for an expansion, leaned over to our director of events and said, loud enough to carry across the head table, "I'm sorry. Isn't that woman the owner of this venue?" Our director of events said, without missing a beat, "Yes, she founded it. She's been the operating partner for the last 3 years." The investor said, "I thought so. We spoke earlier. She knows this building inside and out." The room heard every word. My brother stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a group of people is collectively recalibrating what they've just witnessed. Our venue director crossed the ballroom and came to stand beside me. Our director of operations followed. 2 senior event managers joined them, and each of them acknowledged me in the way they always had. Brief professional exchanges, a status update on the kitchen timeline, a word about the end of evening logistics. To anyone watching, the meaning was unmistakable. These were not colleagues checking in with a peer. These were members of a staff reporting to the person who ran the building. My brother stood at the front of the room, with his microphone, and said nothing. I walked to the edge of the head table, because there were guests there who deserved clarity, and because I have never believed in letting a difficult moment become larger than it needs to be. I should clarify something, I said, not loudly, but clearly. I've owned this venue for 3 years. Before that, I was an event coordinator here. I work alongside my team on event nights because I believe that's how you actually understand a business, not from a distance, but from the inside. My brother booked this evening through our sales team, the same way any client would, and his guests have been looked after beautifully by people who gave a great deal of effort to make tonight successful. I'd ask everyone to take a moment to acknowledge them. The applause that followed was real and immediate. My staff, standing near the service stations and the edges of the room, received it with the quiet dignity of people who know they have done their work well. My brother sat down. The days after moved quickly. The investor from Vancouver sent a message through our venue's contact form, asking whether I would be open to a conversation about a second location. 2 of my brother's other guests reached out through professional channels, one to inquire about booking a corporate retreat, one simply to say that what I had said about understanding a business from the inside had stayed with him. Word travels in a city like Toronto, where the professional networks are tighter than they appear from the outside. Several of my brother's established clients, I eventually learned, had questions after that evening. Not because he had made a bad deal or lost money, but because they had watched him dismiss, in public, someone who turned out to be operating at a level most people in that room hadn't reached. A person's character, one of them reportedly said to a mutual connection, shows most clearly in how they treat the people they believe have nothing to offer. My father called me the following week. The conversation was brief and slightly formal, the way conversations become when someone is working hard to say something they have never said before. He told me he hadn't known what I had built. He said he wished he had paid closer attention. I thanked him for calling. My stepmother sent a text message. It said, "Congratulations. Given our history, that was practically a speech." My brother took longer. A few months passed before he reached out. When he did, we met at a coffee shop near King and Spadina on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and he said the kinds of things that clearly cost him something to put into words. He talked about growing up feeling like he had to prove himself, and how that had curdled over years into a habit of measuring himself against everyone around him, including me. He said he hadn't seen me clearly. He said he was sorry. I believed him. Not because people who hurt you always deserve to be believed, but because I could hear in his voice the specific weight of someone who had genuinely arrived at something true about themselves. I told him I forgave him. I also told him that forgiveness and closeness were different things, and that while I hoped we could build something more honest over time, I wasn't returning to a version of our relationship where I absorbed what he needed to put down. He nodded. We finished our coffee and walked out into the street. We went in different directions. That was a beginning, not a resolution. And slowly, over the months that followed, we found our way towards something that worked for both of us. It was not the relationship we had growing up. It was better. The venue continued to grow. We completed a renovation of the outdoor terrace the following year, adding seasonal capacity that extended our bookings further into the calendar, which matters considerably in a city where November through March can otherwise empty an event schedule. We expanded the staff, promoted 3 coordinators into senior roles, and partnered with a local culinary program to build a training pipeline that benefited our kitchen and their students in equal measure. On the first anniversary of the gala, I held a dinner for my team in the same ballroom. Not a celebration of what had happened with my brother. That was never the point. A celebration of what we had built together, and of the people who had shown up every week and cared about the work. Standing in that room, watching my staff talk and laugh over a table they had laid for themselves, I thought about something my father used to say when I was young, before things between us became complicated. He used to say a business was only as good as the reputation it deserved. He meant it as a warning, I think. A caution against embarrassing the family name. But standing there, looking at what we had made, I understood it differently. A business is only as good as the care that goes into it, day after day, from people who believe the work matters. That is the only reputation worth building. I had stopped, a long time ago, waiting for anyone else to confirm what I was worth. And what I had found in the years of working and learning and building quietly, without permission or recognition, was that the confirmation I had been looking for had never been mine to receive from someone else. It had always been mine to earn.